hosted by Joe Restuccia from the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. And you should all be very familiar with our next slide. But just as a reminder, we would like you guys to engage using the chat function with facilitators and other attendees. You can introduce yourself and use the chat throughout the question. If you have any questions or comments, please select to everyone so that everyone can see your message. Excuse me. We'll also hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end of the session. So you can use the Q&A to ask questions of the facilitators, and we'll monitor that to address your questions and comments during and after the session. As always, we will have closed captioning available. So please click on closed caption at the bottom of your screen and then show subtitle. And we will also post a recording of this session on the Summit website following the event. So again, our host is Joe Restuccia, and he's a certified school psychologist with more than 25 years of experience working in public schools. Over the last 20 years, he has worked with students at risk due to social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. Joe has served as a consultant on the impact of trauma on student learning to the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative and is co-author of Helping Traumatized Children Learn. Without further ado, please take it away, Joe.
Thank you, Hannah, and welcome everyone. I'm glad to be with you this afternoon. My name is Joe. I am a 35+ year educator in the public schools, serving both as a teacher and a psychologist. And I am honored and delighted to be a part of the conference. I mean, so many ideas, so much information. And what I'd like to do this afternoon in the time we have is have a discussion to talk about how we begin to bring these ideas into our schools and integrate them. And the process to do that is a process that begins with you identifying what's important in your school, in your classroom. It is those local, if you will, concerns or priorities that drive what I'm going to be talking about. So as I'm talking, I'd like you to be thinking, and I know a lot of you who were in the action planning sessions before this have probably already started that, thinking about what are our priorities? What are the concerns that are of import to us? And that as we talk about and plan to take action on those priorities, do it in a way that also creates for us safe and supportive trauma-sensitive schools. Next slide. And the next slide. So I want to begin with a very quick review of why trauma. Of all the things to worry about, why is trauma so important? And I want to begin by looking at data that I'm sure a lot of you have seen a number of times, the original ACE study data. This is some selected data points from that study. And the key piece here is how prevalent these adverse childhood experiences are. And I would remind everyone that the substance abuse number you're looking at 26.9%, this is all pre-opioid crisis data, so that certainly that substance abuse number might be much higher. I also include with the original ACE study data, some data from a study done in Philadelphia in 2013, adding some additional risk factors. Students who are witnessing violence in their neighborhoods, students who are feeling discrimination in their everyday interactions and activities, and students who feel that they are living in an adverse neighborhood, a neighborhood where they don't feel safe, where they don't feel they can really move about freely without fear of harm or bad things happening to them. And if you look at these individual categories and you sum it together, if you sum the Philadelphia study with the original ACE study, more than 80% of our students have at least one category of adverse childhood experience. And I think that's the core takeaway here, which is this is a ubiquitous piece of our children's experience. Adverse experience is the norm. It is not an exception. Next slide, please. The impacts of these adverse or potentially traumatic experiences can be very broad and very deep, and can include everything from neurobiological development to epigenetic impacts. What I want to talk about very briefly are the functional impacts of what this can look like in school. And I start with academic performance, and I break that into two areas. The first is the impact on what I would call core academic skills. And I begin here with language. Language, both expressive and receptive, written and read. It can impact language. It can also impact memory, particularly sequential memory, which ties into our perception of cause and effect. The other category of academic impacts include executive function, if you will, goal-directed behavior, that students' ability to set a goal, develop a plan to achieve that goal, execute the goal, and then reflect on what happened. And if that turned out to be an effective way to achieve that goal, storing that information away. And the next time that goal is in front of the student, they have a process, if you will, to apply to accomplish that goal. That can be very interrupted by students with significant traumatic experience. I also want to talk a little bit about attention. A lot of kids with significant traumatic experience might also carry an ADHD diagnosis. But if you look closely at how these students are operating in school, you in fact see that they're paying very close attention to a lot of factors around them, but they're factors around what they perceive as threats to their safety. So they might be focused on tone of voice, physical proximity to other people. Their filters, their sensory filters may be down, and so they might be hearing or sensing things that most of us are filtering out if we're feeling safe and centered. And so it can have these impacts on the academic side. On the behavioral side, there are the obvious behavioral pieces that we can see in students who are hypervigilant and can react in unexpected ways, that can overreact to situations that, I think of a student who I'd known for a couple of years and lived in a pretty chaotic situation. And he came in one morning, I said hello to him, and he gave me a not very pleasant reply to my hello. That they are in this state of hypervigilance, this state of constantly looking at the world as a dangerous place, so they can overreact, rapid, unexpected mood shifts. There are also students who have learned that if they can exert some control over what's happening around them, it helps them to feel safer. And so these are students who might push back against a request or against doing an activity that they're uncomfortable with, or an activity that they feel they're going to fail. And so they learn to be oppositional and push back to try and attain some level of control over their environment and what's happening around them. And these two groups of students, there's students who are front and center. It's like they're raising their hand saying, hey, over here, look at me. I am struggling, I'm having a problem. But I want to emphasize there's a third group on the behavioral side, and that is the group of students who have learned that they stay safe by flying under the radar, that we really don't know, we really don't perceive anything's out of sorts with them. I think of a young lady who I met her junior year in high school in my very first job, and she would come visit me 3-4 mornings a week, and we got along great, and she'd come in and we talked, and she was a joy. She was an average student, family had a good reputation in town. She was just a student I knew in the high school. She graduated, I went to her graduation. 12 years after her graduation, I get a letter from this young lady, and she's thanking me for being there for her because she was being physically abused at home. And no one had any idea. And that she was able to reach out and make a connection that supported her. I was her, I'm in school, I'm going to be safe transition person. So when I talk about behavior, I ask you to think not only about those students who are front and center, raising their hand saying, I'm having a problem, if you will, and those students who we don't really know. The third piece I want to talk about very briefly is relationships. Students with significant traumatic experience come into relationships with that lens of what's safe and what isn't. Am I going to be safe? Can I trust this person? And very often it is that lens that keeps them from fully engaging. It is that lens that makes them overreactive. All those things that can interfere with learning in the classroom are also present in their interactions with peers. Next slide, please. And so what you have is, you have students who, because of their experience, come to school with maybe not the best set of skills we'd like them to have to be successful. And in fact, understanding this shared understanding of the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning is critical to understanding how our students learn and why they behave the way they do. It is an added dimension to our understanding of our students and how to help them. And if we don't have this understanding, if we don't have this shared understanding in the school, we begin to see the manifestations of that student's impacts of trauma on that traumatic experience on that student as character flaws. There's something about that student that isn't right. They're not motivated. They really aren't able to make friends. They never really come to school. They're very disruptive. When we have that knowledge of the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning, it gives us that lens to begin to better understand what's going on with a student, and perhaps a way to respond to that student that supports their learning and engagement in school. Next slide, please. So how do we address these impacts? And I want to talk about addressing them from the perspective of classroom and school-based communities. And I want to be clear when I do this that I'm not saying that individual supports aren't important. They are very important and have helped countless numbers of students over the years. I mean, just think within your school, you could probably rattle off large numbers of students who have benefited from individual supports. I'm going to talk about school-wide and classroom supports, those community supports, as the complement, if you will, to the individual supports that we have in place due to special education laws, as well as other supports for our kids. And there are two core elements to how we create safe and supportive trauma-sensitive classroom and schools. And the first is thinking in terms of whole child. And the second is really being aware of the power of community to support our students. Next slide. You know, when we are talking about whole child, our concept of whole child comes from the work done at Children's Hospital in Boston by Margaret Blaustein and Amy Tishelman, and it involves their ARC model, ARC standing for attachment, resiliency, and competence. And we took those three elements, competence, relationship, and self-regulation in this in this slide that I'm showing you. We took it into schools, and the school nurse, the first school we went into, within one day, the school nurse approached me and said, "What about physical health and well-being?" And she was right on the money. So our concept of whole child is competency, relationship, self-regulation, and physical health and well-being. And competency, think in terms of Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. It is that in addition to the academic side of things, the mathematical and the linguistic, it is that kinesthetic competency, that athlete, that dancer. It is that artistic competency, that musical competency, and that interpersonal competency that some kids can have. And so those competencies sit there as part of that child, a very strong part of that child. Think in terms of relationships. What is the social network this child sits within? And what are the impacts of that social network, both within school with peers and adults, as well as outside of school with peers and adults? That child's ability to self-regulate. And self-regulation being viewed in the context of Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence, self-regulation as that picking and choosing of the best fit for a perceived social situation so that my behavior is viewed as socially acceptable and social skill-based. And then, of course, physical health and well-being. And the key point about whole child is that in many cases, the core to academic success, not only, please, I emphasize that, not only is about quality instruction and time and learning, but can also be about some of these other elements of whole child. Think about that student who comes into a classroom at the beginning of the year and recognizes some friends in the class and maybe recognizes the teacher as his freshman football coach. So now that student walks in and on day one has a relational network in the classroom that allows that student to feel relaxed and in a safe place with friends and acquaintances, right? Their willingness to engage academically has just increased by bent of those relationships. I also think about a school I worked with that, an elementary school that had high levels of office referrals between 9:30 and 10 o'clock every morning. It was like clockwork. And when the staff got together to talk about this, they also began talking about how much food the teachers in the school stored in their supply closet because kids were coming hungry. And they decided as a staff that they would go after a locally sponsored grant to provide breakfast for every student in the classroom. And they did that. And they got the grant. And within 2 weeks of students being given breakfast in the classroom, and it was every student in the school, the frequency of those morning office referrals dropped by 70%. And in reviewing and looking at that, the staff then said, well, if we added to that, providing the students with a more welcoming transition into school in the morning. So they put greeters at the front door. And when students walked into the classroom, the teachers would be there and students could choose their own greeting for the teacher. And when they implemented that second step, they achieved another 25% reduction. So at the end of 4 to 5 weeks, utilizing their, they were identifying that issue and utilizing resources they could get a hold of, some of them just within the school itself, they were able to reduce those office referrals by 95%. It's a pretty impressive piece. Next slide, please. So you have that concept of whole child and the interrelationship of those elements of whole child to a student's success in school. Let's talk about the importance of community. And research on the impacts of trauma is very clear that the single most significant resiliency factor that you can provide someone with significant traumatic experience is meaningful connection to community, not just a place in the community, or if you will, a seat in the classroom, but belonging to that community, a sense of being valued and a part of that community. I would ask you to think about yourselves and think about when good things happen, where do you go to share that information? We go to our communities, we go to our friends, we go to our family, we go to our colleagues. And when we need support, when things are happening that we need some support with, where do we go? Again, we go to our communities. We are at our core communal beings, and the importance of community, and again, that sense of a true sense of belonging and connection to the community is extraordinarily powerful. I would also posit that one of the other issues around the importance of community is that we don't really know all the kids who are significantly impacted by traumatic experience. And I'm sure you know many who are, and you might suspect others, but I'll guarantee you that there are students in your school and in your classroom who have significant traumatic experience that impact their learning and impact their ability to engage. Next slide, please. So we have these core elements of whole child and this core element of community, if you will, community as a school community and community as a classroom. So what is the definition of a trauma-sensitive school? And it's a school or classroom where all students feel safe, welcomed, if you will, they belong, they truly belong to the school, and supported. And I might add to that, where all students and staff feel safe, like they belong, welcomed, and supported. And it's a school where we're addressing trauma's impact on learning, including trauma from systemic issues like racism, gender bias, and other structural inequities, sit at the center of its mission. It is aware of these, and it is working to address them. Next slide, please. So how do we get there? So if that's how do we create this school that everyone, all students and staff feel safe, welcome, supported, like they belong? And it begins with our local urgencies or concerns. What are the issues in your school? As you think about your school, you think about how it operates, or you think about your classroom. What are the urgencies? What are the things that keep you up? What are the things that keep spinning in your head? How do we help those students who seem to be hijacking my class? How do we work together better as a staff? How do we, right? What are those urgencies? That's where we start. And that once we have identified those urgencies and set priorities on which ones are the most important or which one or two, then it's a matter of developing a plan of action. And it is an action, an action plan that is guided by a set of norms and values that are at their core trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive. So it is the taking of action guided by these attributes that creates a trauma-sensitive school. It is also identifying our concerns and developing an action plan that is the piece that allows us to begin to integrate the wonderful ideas, the wonderful information that you hear at conferences like this, or we pick up reading articles, et cetera. It is that spending the time to identify our concerns that keeps us focused on what are we going to do about our concerns, and allows us to aggregate available resources together to take action. It is about taking action in this inquiry-based process that is the core of becoming a trauma-sensitive school. Next slide, please. So these attributes, if you will, these norms and values of a trauma-sensitive school lie at the heart of how we take action, and they guide how we take action. And the first one is, again, understand the impact of traumatic experience on student learning. This shared understanding, as I mentioned earlier, is essential to provide that added dimension of understanding our students, how they learn, and why they behave the way they do. That we need to support student needs in all of the 4 domains. We need to support student needs of the whole child: competency, self-regulation, relationships, physical health, and well-being. And that we help students feel safe and valued. And helping students feel safe and valued, let me give you this example. I've done a lot of work with students who just aren't particularly successful in school. In fact, I started my career in juvenile corrections, and worked my way upstream because I felt if I could intervene sooner, it might be more effective than reacting, get a little more proactive on the school side. And oftentimes I'd be working with kids who might get suspended or might get in trouble in a disciplinary way. And I would make it a point when we were either doing an intake or we were processing what had happened with the students to make 2 key points. The first is, I'm really glad that you're back in school. I'm really glad that you're here. We missed having you in school. And the second one is that when we complete this meeting, the slate is clean. What happened in the past is in the past, and we're moving forward. And the impact on students to, if you will, have that opportunity to hit the reset button was dramatic in a number of kids that I worked with. So helping students feel safe and valued. Then the last one, connecting students to the school committee, that sense of belonging. I worked with a middle school, and one of the teams in the middle school was thinking about, so do our kids feel like they belong? Do our kids feel like they're part of our community in our middle school team? And it was a 3-teacher team, and there was 85 or 90 kids. And what they did at the next team meeting, their staff team meeting, is they took yellow stickies and put the name of each kid on a yellow sticky, each student. And they put the yellow stickies on a whiteboard in the room where they met. And then their instruction to each other was to go up and pull off the yellow sticky of any student who you feel you know well. Now, they obviously knew their students, but this was more of a student who you feel a connection with, a relationship with. And the teachers did that. And there were 5 stickies left on the whiteboard. And 4 of those 5 stickies just happened to be high frequency behavior problems for the team. And so as a team, they talked about how would we reach out and engage with these students, help them feel more of a connection with us, help them feel a sense of belonging, help them feel like they're valued part of the team. And they come up with some ideas to do that, whether it was 30-second conversations, which is see the student in the hallway walking somewhere, walk up next to him and ask him how he's doing and what's up. And they did it by, working with all of their students around what it is that they liked and didn't like: movies, music, sports, et cetera, and then using that to develop communication and relationship bridges with not only these 5 kids, but other kids in the on the team. And over time, for the 4 of those kids who were the discipline problems, through those 4 kids, the intensity and frequency of their disruption dropped dramatically. Again, these attributes guide our action, guide our decision making. Next slide, please. There are 2 more attributes that are involved in this guidance for the action we take. Working together as a team, encouraging that teamwork and coordination. And I would begin here really talking about the staff within a school. How do we work together as a team? How do we make sure we're on the same page? And not that we're always in lockstep agreement. Let's have the disagreement. But if we have that in a respectful way, we learn from those discussions. We grapple with issues that are important to grapple with. Anyone who thinks that some of the issues we face in public schools have simplistic solutions are wrong. And so as a staff, to have that chance and opportunity to grapple and discuss and share points of view can be very powerful and very important. And as we come together as a staff, to engage parents in a meaningful way, to engage outside agencies in a meaningful way. And again, the focus is our priorities, our concerns, what's important to our local school community. Then the last piece is being flexible and innovative to ever-changing demands. That flexibility, I often think about this attribute in terms of, let's become proactive. If there are situations that we're aware of that are going to come along, and again, I think of a school I worked with in a small, excuse me, city in Massachusetts, and they had a very heavy Haitian population, very high Haitian population in the school. And when the earthquakes occurred several years ago, and it will probably happen again because of the devastating earthquake that just struck Haiti again, they knew that given the size of their community and town, that there would be an influx of school-aged children into their school system as they left Haiti and moved in with family, relatives, et cetera, and that they would be coming with some pretty significant, potentially traumatic experience. And so they got ready. And ready meant everything from welcome kits for students who came to school, which would include pencils and paper and other materials and in their books and whatnot. So they had these welcome kits ready to go. They pulled together a group of student mentors who could speak Haitian Creole, who could greet these students when they came in and serve as that introduction, that bridge between where they were coming from and what they were coming into. They coordinated with local community agencies to support parents and to support the relocation of folks as they were coming in. Again, proactive. I think about the opioid epidemic that we're all in, and assure you there are districts I work in Massachusetts that are highly involved in the opioid epidemic. And the districts that have been thinking proactively about, so what's our response when? What if a student comes in, there are police at the house? What if there's an opioid death in the family? Having those protocols in place, being proactive and ready to go is an important piece of being safe and supportive, trauma sensitive. And if we use these attributes, the 4 that I mentioned on the previous page around, understanding the impacts, thinking in terms of whole child, everyone feels safe and valued, and encouraging connection and belonging, combined with encouraging teamwork, and we're flexible and innovative and proactive in anticipating the needs of our kids in our community, that as we use these to guide our decision-making, our action planning in this more formal piece, these become part of how we think about making decisions and how we think about how we do our work within the school. Next slide, please. So let me give some examples of what this looks like on the ground, because one of the other points I want to make, and I know it echoes some of the messages you've received during the conference, which is small things can have huge impacts. That it isn't necessarily just about getting more resource. I mean, is more resource good? I'm the first one to say, hallelujah, more resource. But we have resources that we can use in whatever way we can to address our concerns. And I have some examples here that I think would demonstrate that. You know, I already talked about that student-staff connection piece, the whiteboard. And when I talked about the elementary school, I talked about the impact of those greetings on student behavior. But I also want to mention that those greetings that became part of how kids came into school became part of, you know, it's interesting, it was geared towards helping kids feel welcome coming into the school, but that greeting, welcoming mindset that occurred at the beginning of the school day in that school permeated everything. And so people came into school, and as they were greeting, there was this sense of, you know, the sense of encouragement, the sense of positivity that worked throughout the school and gave people a sense of, you know, interaction, community. It's very powerful stuff. I want to talk about that staff communication piece. And that staff communication piece, one of the first schools we worked with, there was a concern among general ed staff and staff in general that they were not necessarily receiving all the information that was available about kids. And that counseling staff and leadership in the building said that they did the best they could, but there was some information that was confidential and they could not share. And teachers appropriately said, and this was a very animated conversation, shall I say, teachers appropriately said, we hear and understand that, but if we don't know that information, if I don't know that Johnny had police at his house last night for domestic violence call, how do I know how to respond to Johnny? And so in their back and forth, they came up with a solution. And the solution they referred to as the red envelope. Although they never used red envelopes because red envelopes are very expensive, but they did use red sheets of paper. And they would fold them up and staple them. And on the red sheet of paper, if someone in the school was aware of something that had happened to a student outside of school or even within the school that was of significance, they would write the student's first name and initial. The person who knew what had happened to that student would be put on the red envelope, on that red sheet of paper as well. Although in many cases that information was confidential and couldn't be shared, but they put the name there anyway, just so you knew where it was coming from. And they would then distribute this stapled together red envelope to every staff who would come in contact with that student in the school. And so it was just a heads up, something's going on with Johnny. And it had an incredible impact on the school. And I think the reason for that impact was twofold. First, I think there were a lot more red envelopes than teachers thought they would receive. So that it was, if you will, a tangible representation of the ACE study of how commonplace these adverse experiences are. And secondly, as they would receive the red envelope, if there was a normal punitive response, they would alter that to a more positive restorative response. And as they did that with kids, they started to say, well, why don't I do this with every student? Why don't I use, I mean, it works and it feels a lot better and it's improving my relationship with the students. And so over time, a lot of the punitive interactions between adults and students were transformed into learning-based restorative practices. The last two are really, to me, very exciting. You know, I was working in a high school and they were talking about how they could get students who needed social skill development together in a small group to do some small group social skill development. And these were students they were identifying were students who were often in trouble, often breaking the rules. They were disruptive kids. And if you know anything about high school and high school schedule, it's very difficult to pull kids at the same time from different schedules, from different classes. And as they were trying to figure out how to do it and thinking maybe we should wait till next year and, can we even do this? Someone in the room said, we already do that. And everyone said, what do you mean we already do that? They said, we already do that. We call it detention. And detention at that point in time was a place where you went to be punished. You either did your homework or you sat there with your hands folded for the requisite half hour or 40 minutes. And what they did is that they then took this detention because they realized a lot of the kids that they were concerned about were in fact in detention on a regular basis. And they turned detention into a small group social skills meeting. And they used collaborative problem solving, but again, whatever curriculum or whatever ideas or whatever work you would want to do, this became, if you will, a skill building session for kids who obviously needed those skills because they were crossing the lines and struggling with self-regulation. And as that developed, they then began to introduce, if you will, emotional de-escalation techniques for kids like meditation, relaxation response, and yoga into the detention time. And so as this grew and took hold, they again shifted what detention was about, but it also fed back into how we were beginning to look at discipline within the high school. Again, small steps that people could take within their school, within the resource constraint of what they have to address their local priorities. Small is the new big. Next slide, please. So what does the research tell us? So we've been doing this and at TLPI, we did a demonstration study and there's been an unpublished, soon to be published follow-up study done at Lesley University. But when this work gets taken on by schools, what you get is pretty amazing. First of all, you get positive changes in student behavior. You get incredible improvements in relationships among staff and students, both within staff, within students, and between and among staff and students. Educators, because now we can as a school identify our priorities and begin to take action to address them and review and renew that whole process. There's a level of educator empowerment and collaboration that comes in and is significant. The last piece I want to talk about is that without it even being an issue identified within any of the schools that were part of the study that we work with, it was very clear that this work of creating safe and supportive trauma-sensitive schools was affirming cultural identity of students and staff and promoting a strong sense of belonging. So it was creating culturally responsive learning environments. Next slide. So, if I were to summarize, again, the importance of that shared understanding of the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning, and that shared understanding, really the prevalence of these adverse experiences, the universal nature of them, and the potential impacts they can have on student learning. That we think in terms of whole child, that academic success is a function of addressing the needs of the whole child. And we utilize whole school, whole classroom, we utilize our in-school communities, if you will, to complement the individual supports that in many cases are already there. And that we do that by identifying our local issues within our school. What are the things we're concerned about, and how can we take actions, again, within our realm of control to begin to address those priorities? And that we are guided by these attributes of a trauma-sensitive school. And those attributes, by the way, are incredibly derivative of the principles of trauma-informed care. And that at the core of all this is that whole concept of inquiry. What are our priorities? Let's identify them. What are we going to do about this? What can we do? Let's do something. And again, small things have big impacts. And I think the final piece I would want to leave you with is that all students benefit from this work. We are not about identifying subsets of students. It is about creating school culture, school climate that is safe and supportive for all students. And it's guided by our understanding of the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning. Next slide. So I wanted to give you a chance to look at so where can I get some resources? What's up? The website, www.traumasensitive.schools.org, that is TLPI's website. And all the other elements that are identified here are on that website. Including the 2 volumes of Helping Traumatized Children Learn. The purple covered version of that is a really wonderful summary, if I say so myself, of the impacts of trauma on student learning. And the teal covered book really outlines in much more detail the inquiry-based process that I have quickly reviewed with you today. Again, I want to open it up to questions, although I don't have much more time, but I open it up to questions, and I encourage you to think in terms of identifying those priorities and taking action within the context of your resource set guided by these attributes. So I don't know, are there any questions, Nancy, in the question or in the chat?
We have not received any questions. We do have time for about 1 or 2 if anybody has some pressing needs. Otherwise, we may just shift on to the closing.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any.
Anybody have any pressing questions? We just received one question that is, what are strategies for dealing with resistance around moving away from punitive practices?
So that resistance, I'm assuming, is coming from certain staff in the building, maybe perhaps for whom this has worked well. My approach to implementing new approaches to discipline is to identify that handful in every school I've been in, there's sort of that handful of kids who are just wreaking havoc, that 8 to 12 kids, and really focus on them and bring the new approach to them, the new approach of teaching them skill, teaching them that self-awareness, and then giving them the skills to begin to gain some control over how they feel and control over their actions and behavior. I think if you start there and realize success, in every place we've done that, that spreads very quickly as people recognize that there are now some tools we can use within the school. And if I'm happy to talk about that in more detail offline if someone wants to talk more about that. So if there are no more questions, I am going to turn it over to Nancy.
No, just to me.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Joe, for that fascinating talk. And thank you for helping us close this 2-day summit.